Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on wherever you are. And thank you for joining me and my co-host, Ryan Bartley, co-founder of Fabric. We are going to talk about today's 5 e-commerce tech trends for 2022. Perfect timing, since I just spoke about this at Western Michigan University yesterday. More on kind of the grocery, online grocery, and what we've seen on the e-commerce side in the past and looking ahead. So perfect timing, Ryan, to consider this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. We're gonna have fun today.
Thank you for having me be here. Thank you.
Yeah, really, as we kind of start to look at some of these trends, and like I said, I've spent weeks doing this for this big presentation. Some of the things that we consider, which maybe 2 years ago we wouldn't have, was around simplifying processes, simplifying vendors, right? That was kind of number one, because that can be very overwhelming. The second was, right, from a consumer perspective, this idea of, kind of removing friction, right? And this seamless experience. And as we in some ways, right, during the pandemic, we really got to experience a really kind of, new way of commerce for many of us. And right, if you look at the percentages, right, especially in grocery, the people who never, like went from like 2.7% of penetration, and now we're in double digits. I mean, that's a big difference in a very short period of time. And, there has been also this real interest in subscription type of models. Especially it's been interesting. I've looked at all these like candy models and like different, kind of for different CPGs, getting ready for the presentation yesterday. Of course, global cross-border e-commerce, I think, has been fascinating, and certainly much more on the apparel and footwear side. And then, I would say one of the biggest questions we get these days is around kind of the phasing of third-party cookies and how to monetize first-party data. And that's just, to me, it's like a game changer for retail, right? It really kind of allows these retailers to play in a different way than where they have before. And so, maybe we can kick it off with some questions. But to me, sitting in boardrooms and seeing how complicated this gets, and right, every CIO has kind of like 100 things on their to-do list. And I'm like, if you really want them to prioritize, how do you kind of see that kind of changing over time? And how do they not only figure out what are the top 3, what are the solutions to solve those, and how do they kind of, make those decisions? Because I think it's become increasingly complicated, because there's also a lot more kind of internal stakeholders who have an opinion.
Yeah, I think great question. As you grow as a business, obviously you build processes and policies and rules and teams that want to work together, and that gets you to that growth. However, what I see is in a lot of cases that leads to a lot of baggage that reduces speed and efficiency of the team. And so in a lot of cases, what we see is, teams that are coming together and they have best intentions, but it may require a committee and a process flow to, update the homepage. Or we've seen at, large retailers with large catalogs, the time to actually bring an item online could be in multiple people hours, because they got to input data in so many places and so many systems. And so if you think about that, that's just going to reduce your speed of change and the ability to support the customer, even with their best intentions. So in a lot of cases, what we do is we talk to retailers of all sizes and large retailers who have built this complexity up over time, and just say, get back to the basics and simplify. If you have a team that's doing the same thing twice a day, that's a place for automation. And obviously at Fabric, with our commerce platform, we think a lot about how do we support the merchant, how do we support the marketer, how do we support the inventory planner, site operator, to actually up-level them, give them the right tools where they don't have to do that low level, putting things in Excel spreadsheet, manipulating data and moving over. Will change their job. For example, if you're enriching your product content, where does that work happen? Well, the work should happen with your vendors, and that data should flow into your systems. And you should automate a lot of those processes, where instead of a data entry clerk, you become a data editor, and you're really editing all of the richness of your brand and the style of your brand before it gets to the customer. So I think you know, back to the basics, make it simple and reduce all of the kind of outliers too. If you have a returns policy that requires a page of writing, there's a red flag right there, right? Just keep it simple, and that will reduce the overhead for your teams to actually do value added work as opposed to kind of just manage the machine.
Well, and I think these days, right? So we're seeing several things. Certainly, kind of the chief merchandising officers and GMMs and DMMs are taking on so much more.
Yeah.
But also the fact that everyone in the organization is really kind of owns sustainability in some ways. That I think if we can free up a lot of those, kind of heavily process oriented, right, they can really focus on what matters to their employees, their customers, and ultimately their shareholders. And so I think really what you're doing is, giving them back time in their day to really, kind of make, decisions that will impact, the company, but, also the environment ultimately.
Yeah, totally. I think just getting that headspace from simplifying the process and thinking about the process. Is this process or is this set of tools that you're using really differentiating your business? And is it changing your quarterly results, or is it something that you can just simplify and it's not a differentiator or core IP that you should be focused on? So we think a lot about that, like where's your differentiation? Focus on that and get the headspace to do it as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was really interesting. I spoke to a retailer last weekend and they're, kind of focusing on this, they've got their kind of brands and then they're thinking about kind of how, how can they, for them, mental health is very important. How can they either create a brand
Mm.
or, kind of extend something they're already doing? And so they were saying, right, that they're trying to like automate as much as they can because they really need time to focus on this whole new thing that's personally important to them and probably important to their customers. So I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And I think it can really contribute to a lot of the purpose-driven retailers and brands, which,
Oh.
we're seeing right now. So as we think about this kind of, the seamless experience, removing friction, what ultimately does that mean if you're on the consumer side or on the employee side?
Well, as a first principle, no consumer or no employee wants more friction. And so you're always going to get a good return on investment from reducing friction. I think in the shopping experience, there's multiple different angles that you have to look at from a consumer perspective, but just simplifying the experience, giving them the right content at the right time, and ultimately giving them a simple transactional process. We still talk about, there's areas of commerce experiences that are still really difficult. Search is one, product finding methods. And then when a customer, has their wallet out ready to pay and you're putting friction in cart and checkout, those are just areas that we feel are no brainers to just reduce the friction and simplify the experience as much as possible. On the
You know,
employee side, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I would say you should have, right, because as you're saying those, I'm actually can feel myself getting stressed, and it takes a lot. But I'm like, it'd be interesting, right, as you look at people's blood pressure and you start to talk about those things and see, right, which really, because I mean, the friction at checkout, right? I mean, that's why you have such high, let's just say, low conversion rate online, because you've now spent all this time and maybe you didn't have like a complete the look, so you're going around kind of like really figuring out how to complete this outfit or meal or whatever it might be. And then you go to check out and you're like, oh my gosh, I have to enter like, everything,
Yeah.
including like my social security number and date of birth to like check out. It's really, one of those things I think that consumers in different, it's fascinating to see kind of what really ends up being that friction point. And I think why now are we seeing like the role of headless commerce come into place, to provide these, digital experiences that we would have all assumed from the outside looking in would already be completely seamless.
Yeah, you would hope so. But obviously, if you go sit with your customers, which I encourage everybody to do, you're obviously sitting on mountains of data and mountains of insights. However, one of the highest leverage days that you can have is go sit with your customers and just watch them. And you'll find those friction points pretty simply as well, too. And those are the simple things that you should be solving, because that's repeated across your entire customer base when you're seeing those painful, simple tactical things that can solve for it. And a lot of that is technology. I think as you mentioned, headless commerce allows companies to move quicker and really differentiate all parts of their stack so they have best of breed capabilities across it, as opposed to have this kind of plain vanilla platform that's hard to change and kind of slow to change as well.
Now that's really insightful. And then, one of the things I mentioned in kind of our opening was around like subscription models, which
Mm.
to me, I love it because it's like surprise and delight. It's like a gift for yourself or a gift for your dog or a gift for your family. And so, right, we've done, many of them because I think they all, right, have such a great point of view, but I know there are retailers who are still considering this. They're trying to kind of tweak the ones that they have. And how does that ultimately impact, the strategies that retailers have? Because even though I think this year we're looking at a very sizable kind of, market, the growth is still stronger than honestly than I would have expected.
Mm. Yeah, from a subscription standpoint, obviously as a brand, what you want to do is build a relationship with your customer and a long-term relationship where they're part of your brand. I talk around, kind of the end of direct to consumer and the start of direct to community. And you're really trying to build that brand experience that connects somebody with you. And so you have to go and think about really your business model. What is your business model and how do you evolve that over time? We're at, I would think, the early innings of really the subscription and service economy. And if you can be important in the life of your consumer or your customer, then you build up this lifetime value. And defining that strategy, that subscription strategy or loyalty strategy, I think is kind of very top of mind and important as we talk to companies, because they're thinking about how do I repeat this and how do I get this person to become part of my community and part of my brand.
Well, I also think that, as we're going into probably an unprecedented inflationary environment in US history, that, there's also this idea, not only the surprise and delight, but that, right, subscriptions can often be like a good deal, right? And
Mm.
if you think about it from a retailer perspective, right, they're opening up their, kind of potential to sell more to one consumer, but, one consumer, one household is also kind of buying, typically more than one product at a time on a monthly, quarterly, et cetera basis. And so I think it's really, like I said, almost every retailer we've worked with from kind of the strategy side on doing subscriptions, it's one of the things I get the most pleasure out of because there's always surprise for the upside, right? Every single time. And right, how often
Yeah,
do you get to do something like that?
there's a tremendous amount of upside on the business side of the house too. If you think about, supply chain logistics and forecasting, you start to normalize or be able to forecast better as you build a services model that's repeatable. And so I think it can do wonders from a P&L perspective too for the business. And
Yeah.
it's, like you said, good for the consumer as well too.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think that the kind of some of the tools and the solutions and, once again, planning from a supply chain perspective, right? If this is like the date, right, that these boxes all have to be, sent out, that, what we found is that they have been able to either, in some cases, find new kind of a new source of products very quickly, right, so that they hit that date. It has enabled them to be, I think, much more agile under circumstances. Once again, right, like the date is the date. You can't like delay it on a subscription box. And I think they've also just found that, you talk, I love this idea of kind of D2C, meaning direct to community, because I do think in many cases we've seen they've involved their community, right? When they have had, whether it's inflation challenges or supply chain issues. And so, right, you feel, right, differently about, right, it's a two-way conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And
Definitely.
that I think is pretty significant. And it goes into kind of our next point around, right, cross-border e-commerce, because I think what we've seen in many of these cases, right, is that, even subscriptions, there's a lot of interest, geographically diverse. And so as we start to think, and this is, I would say, kind of global cross-border e-commerce has been a pain point and a friction point. And a lot of it is around, right, currency conversion and, supply chain. But I do find that the currency aspect is one that we hear about a lot, and then different
Mm-hmm.
just kind of rules and regulations around privacy. So maybe you can just kind of talk about how you see that and also how you can look at simplifying that.
Well, the beauty is, I think there's a lot of pull around the world around the brands. If you've built a brand, it's going to be quite universal in terms of demand. And we see this all the time. We've seen, I'll give you an example, an apparel retailer who was building a new site for their US business. However, as we looked at what their next opportunities were, 50% of the traffic was coming from Southeast Asia and Japan and the East. And where do they hedge where do they spend their time and effort? Do they optimize for that US site, or do they quickly build an international site and distribution capabilities to that audience that is demanding their products? And so I think today now there's tools and capabilities in place where you can ultimately provide that local experience to that international customer. And that's really what you're looking for, from a service level is how can I build and compose the tools together that I need to be able to support that customer so they don't have to pay the landed duty costs, and they don't have to worry about tariffs, and they don't have to worry about just all the rules and regulations around the world of how commerce has to happen. You should remove that friction and remove any consideration for that. And that consumer should get a local experience from their point of view with this global brand in mind.
Well, and I think you bring up something important, right? Especially when you've got consumers kind of basically begging for your brand to be available in market. Obviously, you save shipping costs and whatnot. But I also think that, when you can start to understand the fit of that consumer and the taste and the desires, not only, right, you have this whole new kind of pipeline of consumers, but even in your home market, right, if you understand your consumers better and some of the nuances, what we found is companies go global, right, then they're even able to have greater success in their kind of home country.
Yeah.
And that I find, I mean, to me, I love the global side of commerce. This I find to be incredibly inspiring. And then even, right, kind of as as you are in that country, right, how do you think about kind of selling and what are the nuances, and right, if there's a shopping holiday or if it's live streaming, right, those are the things that I think can really make the difference between, doing okay and really kind of knocking the cover off the ball. So I think it's, the opportunity is definitely, kind of significant, and then having kind of a platform that can really help you leverage the data and the tools and
Mm.
your insights from one market into another. I mean, I think it starts to change the direction. And also in some ways, right, if you can leverage volume, right, if you can, from a SG&A perspective, you can change your leverage point, right, then you can absorb the inflation better too. So it's, to
Totally.
me, it makes a huge difference. All right, so our last point, which this time has gone way too quickly, is, how can, to me, we've built this whole kind of, retail at the edge, and one of the key components is actually this idea around, as we're seeing the phasing out of cookies, what can retailers do in terms of their own data, right, their first party data, and what does that mean, and can they monetize it, right? I mean, this is something we're getting questions on all the time. So Ryan is my go-to on this topic. Where are we? Where are we going? And what do retailers need to consider along the way?
Well, obviously, we had a shock this past year, surprise, with the privacy laws and regulations and kind of implementations that happened, and I don't foresee that ending. I foresee consumers and large companies continuing down this path of really thinking about who is in ownership of the data, and so I think it simply means that retailers need to work harder and to earn that trust and to earn the right to build that relationship with the customer. And so you're going to have to invest, and you're going to have to focus on how do you build that relationship? How do you bring that data together in the right tools and the right data stack that's modern, so you can activate on that? And so I think simply it's just a function of some additional work that brands have to double down on, because over time that first party data, I think, is going to be really, really important as consumers continue to get more leverage in terms of how they offer and provide their data.
It's a really interesting. I mean, I think that, we're still obviously early in this journey, but one that will accelerate. And the, not only do you have kind of, right, new products to sell, but also new insights to gain. And if you as a retailer, right, especially as you're going global and all of these other things that we've discussed, I personally believe, right, that, whether it's, kind of shifting your top three priorities, rethinking kind of what your senior leadership team is working on, right, having headless commerce is the base of all that. I actually think retailers deserve a higher valuation.
Hmm.
And that, to me, that is very unique to 2022, right? So if retailers can start to, think differently about monetizing their digital shelf, if they can now start to, kind of play in the data game, if they can also sell in new channels, and that's all seamless, right? And they can, and everyone in the organization, I think you said very important that I really want to just kind of close this out with, is that so much time is spent getting buy-in, right, from different people in the organization before decisions are made, that if they're all operating kind of in different silos, it really does, work with the retailer. It took about a year to make a decision on something that, we were like, oh, this is going to be great. It's simple, right? First month and 12 months later, but they had to get the whole organization to kind of swim in the, same direction. And so I think that, what you've seen and what you're continuing to see is, having this kind of, it's almost like this, everyone's talking the same language, right? I mean, that is ultimately, if I think about it, kind of what you've created. And just as retailers kind of come together and they understand themselves internally better, and then they understand their community better, right? That's just a game changer.
I agree. I think, ultimately, as a executive team, you have to be thinking about how do I create value for my customers and my constituents across the, different constituents that you must support, from sustainability to consumer to shareholder to employee. And doing that takes a lot of introspection and consideration of what is the right strategy, and then what are the right tools and processes that I need to put in place to support that strategy. And so ultimately, it's a leadership thing to make sure that you're focused on the right inputs and to get the right outputs.
Well, Ryan, I always learn from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was very fun, and looking forward to seeing you at Shop Talk, and hopefully much more in the next few months. Take care. We'll talk to you soon.